let's talk about economics. Let's talk about wealth disparity. Earlier, you were talking about measles outbreak in African countries, for example. Nidhi, we're talking about access to healthcare and, some things that don't end up in the headlines, perhaps, which is another dimension, is where the media eye is placed based on who's actually getting sick and who's dying. So how much of a factor is that in terms of infectious disease dynamics, the socioeconomic dimension?
I reckon it's the biggest factor.
Yeah.
It's huge. And I think if we think about all the neglected tropical diseases, and we call them neglected because they're largely ignored by the developing world because they don't affect us. But, they're primarily seated in the tropics, and they're often present in countries that can least afford to manage them in terms of not having the strong enough health infrastructure and ability to try and protect their people from these diseases. So I think it's actually the biggest determinant in disease patterns globally.
Yeah, we have there's sort of two stages in every disease process. There's the exposure of the human to the pathogen, right? And then there's the course of disease of that pathogen in that human being. And so we can talk about variation in that risk of exposure in the first place, and then we can talk about variation in what's the outcome in that individual, right? I spent a lot of my time worrying about measles virus and the global distribution of measles virus, and what we've seen. There was a measles outbreak in the United States last year. 1,300 people were infected, right? There were no deaths associated with that.
No deaths.
Right? But in areas with very low access to health services, where it's likely that a child may experience the full course of measles disease in the community without ever being able to be seen by a physician, right? The likelihood of that child dying due to that infection goes up astronomically, and you might have a 10 or 15% mortality rate. I think a lot of folks around here aren't thinking very actively about how different the rest of the world experiences these infections.
And just household income level, some studies have looked at how much vector control costs. And, if you think about what people are spending their money on, it's housing and food. And, there often isn't enough money left over every month to consistently use insecticides in your house. Or when you're living in an environment where there's constant rain, and trying to keep down breeding sites around your property is a nonstop job. If you've got other things demanding your attention, work, family, feeding your family, basic living, that stuff tends to fall by the wayside. And so even when we think about interventions, they're going to work in these contexts. They have to be amenable to these situations where people have much higher lists of other needs, I think, compared to what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, I think a lot of these sort of preventative actions are sort of long-term risk avoidance, right? Whereas if you have immediate risks that you're dealing with otherwise, things like hunger or just running out of money, those things will always take precedence, right? So it really is a really basic determinant of what you're able to act on. Your basic economic level really determines how far down into the future you can look and act on risk avoidance.